live. Go ahead.
Hello there, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our second ever Google Plus Hangout. My name is Dan Slepian. I'm the producer of last night's program on the DEA and how the folks in Utah are fighting a war against Mexican drug cartels in their own backyard. I'm here with Chris Hansen, the correspondent of the story, and he's going to introduce our guests today. Chris?
Thanks, Dan. We have with us Frank Smith, who's the assistant agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration in Utah, along with supervisory special agent for the DEA in Utah, Sue Thomas. Guys, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you.
You know, it was interesting watching the show with people who didn't know much about the fact that, number one, Mexican cartels are growing their marijuana in the United States on public land, but also just the logistics and the remote climate out there. I mean, behind the scenes, you know, there was one of those grows investigated and eradicated where we literally had to hike 5 miles at altitude before we even got there. Frank, talk for a moment about the physical challenge of doing a raid like this.
We know with these marijuana grows, of course, our number one concern is public safety. So we're really glad when we have to do these hikes because we feel that the public wouldn't stumble into them. But they're treacherous climbs. You're in areas that there's a lot of rattlesnakes, a lot of natural ground issues where we're climbing to altitude. It's just treacherous. It's hot. The physical fitness level has to be very, very high. And you guys did outstanding. Our biggest concern was that the correspondents wouldn't be able to keep up. You did a great job. You made some of the young guys look foolish.
Well, I was just as concerned about Chris, and he did a great job.
We were concerned about the producer.
Frank, question, you mentioned about, in the show, you mentioned hypothetically 5 people could end up dead if a family stumbles on this hike, and you said, you hope that doesn't happen. But in fact, that no one was killed, but in fact there was some teenage girls that did stumble upon one of these grows. You want to just talk about that a little bit, Sue?
Go ahead, Sue.
In Garfield County in Utah, 2 summers ago, there was a group of girls who were recreating on the public lands. They were swimming in a stream, and one of the workers from the grow got into an argument with some of the other traffickers in the grow, and he left the grow and decided that he wanted to return to Mexico. He stumbled across the girls, and he had a sawed-off shotgun. He pointed the shotgun at the girls and demanded to use their cell phone. He was looking to reach out for other traffickers and have them come pick him up. After speaking with the sheriff in Garfield County and the girls who were interviewed, we realized that those girls would have been killed by that drug trafficker, but he didn't have enough shotgun shells to take them all out. So what saved their lives was their sheer number of them on the public land recreating. But it could have had a catastrophic turnout.
And Danny Perkins, the sheriff of Garfield County, did a phenomenal job because he actually went and found this trafficker and arrested him and brought him to justice.
Frank, we're talking about, in the cases we saw, marijuana grows with a street value of $20 to $40 million. What happens when an innocent civilian stumbles upon this? I mean, obviously the cartel operatives are not going to let this go easily.
Chris, I'm usually very uncomfortable doing media, but we feel like this is such a public safety threat that we don't mind at all, and we appreciate the opportunity to put this message out. Look, there's no doubt in my mind that these traffickers are going to protect these grows, and if a family stumbles into this, they're either going to get killed or severely hurt, especially if the traffickers think they can eliminate what they deem that threat to go tell law enforcement. I don't think it would be a positive outcome at all. So we appreciate the opportunity to bring this public service message and public safety message forward.
Frank, I've been covering law enforcement for some 30 years, and when Dan Slepian came to me and said, did you know that the cartels were growing their marijuana on American soil, I was blown away. What does that say about the reach, the power, the business acumen of the Mexican cartels?
Well, if you look at their business model, Chris, it's very smart, because what they're doing is they're eliminating the threat of crossing it, bringing it across the border. You know, the unusual thing is we always see drugs go west to east. In Utah, through physical and electronic surveillance, I can tell you all the drugs grown in Utah went back to California. That defies logic, and we're not really sure at this point why it's happening, but we have our theories.
So a viewer wanted to know why the marijuana is buried and not burned. Can you explain that?
Can you repeat that question, Dan?
Why the marijuana after you eradicate it all and pull it all up? And you can explain a little bit why you need to pull up at the first 1,000 plants, which I think is interesting. We didn't have time to put in the piece. But what happens after you eradicate it? Why is it buried and not burned?
We pull up the first 1,000 plants with root systems because we need that for prosecution. After that, the rest of the marijuana is just uprooted and it's put in a dumpster where it's buried, because if we burned it, it would have, environmental implications. First off, imagine 20,000 pot plants getting burned. It would be hard to avoid contact with the fumes. So in the interest of having a handful of law enforcement officers not getting a contact buzz from a burn, as well as protecting the environment and releasing the pollutants, because remember, this marijuana is treated with pesticides, fertilizer, various chemicals. So to actually burn it would be catastrophic for the environment. So we find a good landfill, it gets dumped into a huge hole and buried.
Frank, give me a sense for the environmental impact one of these grows has on our very beautiful and precious public land.
Chris, it's catastrophic. The land is being decimated. For every acre of property that is used to grow marijuana, it affects 10 surrounding acres. So we go from being law enforcement operators going in, arresting these individuals, to day laborers pulling the plants, to garbage men at the end of the day. They use illegal fertilizers. In DEA right now, our priorities are the public safety, capturing the traffickers, and right in the top two is the environment. So we will not leave until we clean it up. But it's at a cost of about $17,000 to $20,000 an acre. So when you figure the cost of the law enforcement, the cost of the helicopters, then another $20,000 per acre, and every acre affects 10 acres, and that's if they don't pollute the water stream. So there's a lot of hidden costs by growing these illegal crops on our public lands that the general public wouldn't even ever realize.
Frank, what's the scope of the problem? How many grows represents to what you think actually exists that you've identified?
I think we're probably looking at 25 to 35% of what we get that's actually grown. California, and this is a dated number, it's a 2008 number, had $17 billion of marijuana grown on public lands. If you consider that's maybe even 50%, that would make it a $35 billion business in California alone. We think we're about $500 million to $1 billion in Utah, and it's growing across the country. As we speak, we have agents who have traveled to Wisconsin today to teach our tactics, because they're seeing the exact same trends in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan that we saw here 2 years ago. So it's spreading throughout the nation.
Here's a question from Heidi in Montana. Montana's medical marijuana bill is so restrictive, we fear invasion from the cartel. Is this a legitimate concern? Should we be afraid here in Montana? Sue, why don't you answer that for me?
I think California is living proof that medical marijuana laws and allowing medical marijuana state does not protect any citizens from cartel invasion. If anything, it creates an economic environment that encourages marijuana production. So the citizens of Montana should be concerned. The good news is DEA in Montana is very much on it and aware of marijuana grows on public lands. And much like we fight to protect the people in Utah, we will absolutely fight to protect the people in Montana. But citizens need to speak up and let their legislators know that medical marijuana is not a benefit to the state and brings many unintended consequences.
Well, that actually is a good segue into the next question from Pat, who asked, what do you think of Pat Robertson's statement recently that the U.S. should legalize and tax marijuana?
I think that's naive. The way to deal with an issue isn't to run from it. Look, the American people have an appetite for marijuana and drugs. This is not a law enforcement issue. We can't arrest our way out of this. It's a social issue, and we need to deal with it on that level. It's easy to make statements when you're not out there in the midst of this war, and we're in the midst of this war. Legalizing drugs will do nothing but create a secondary environment, an illegal environment like we're seeing with the marijuana grows on public lands. The majority of our issues are derived and stem from the legalization of medical marijuana in California and a ripple effect across the country. So, at least from my point of view, that's naive.
Here's another.
Dan, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead. Finish up, Sue.
I was just going to say, you can look at it in terms of in New York, go to Canal Street. You can go to Neiman Marcus and buy a fabulous real Chanel purse, or you can go to Canal Street and buy a knockoff Chanel purse. Look at Michigan, where you can buy bootleg cigarettes to avoid the tax. Just because something's legal doesn't mean that there's not going to be a black market for it, where people are trying to avoid paying tax or undercut the retail distribution. Legalization is not the issue.
Here's an interesting question. It's one that we talked about when we were putting this story together from TJ. Why is marijuana a bigger trade commodity in the Mexican drug cartel than cocaine? I was surprised that marijuana accounted for more profits than either meth, which we know is being produced in the Mexican super labs owned by the cartels, or cocaine.
Well, if you look at the business model, they're growing on the public land, so they steal the land, they steal the water. The day labor of the actual people tending it's about $200 a person a day. The net profit is much, much higher. Everything that has come in contact with the marijuana is something that they've either stolen or appropriated from illegal means. So it's all net profit.
Not to mention, they don't have to smuggle it across the border like meth or cocaine. A large number of the border violence outbreaks are as a result of competing cartels to control the border and access to the border to smuggle it into the U.S. The marijuana grown on public lands, you eliminate the whole need for transportation from Mexico or South America into the U.S.
We never had any direct evidence in the terms of our own reporting of this that some of the marijuana from these mountains grown by Mexican drug cartels are ending up in medical marijuana dispensaries. And Frank, you think that that's possible. What a statistic that I found interesting in the course of reporting this that I don't know if many people know is that there are more medical marijuana dispensaries in LA and San Diego than there are Starbucks. And Frank, I guess the question to you is what that culture that exists, a very, very strong legalization culture in some states, how does that affect the work you're trying to do?
Chris, we don't have the luxury of enforcing the laws that we want to. We're cops. And look, that's an issue for the legislators. The day that the American people vote and say marijuana would be legal, whether I agree with it personally or not, I'm going to follow the law and follow our mandate. People love to pose that question to law enforcement, and truly, that's not a law enforcement issue. That's a legislative issue. Look, we're sworn to uphold the laws and enforce the laws of the United States of America, and that's what we will do.
Another question from somebody joining us today. Hi, Chris. It is Sue. Great show last night. One question: do you ever fear for your safety? How dangerous are these raids, Frank?
You know what? They're probably the most dangerous thing that we do. We're moving in a big element. We're moving through some really, really tough terrain. And then when we hike 5 miles in, after usually staying up all night on surveillance, then we get to attack the problem, which is armed, cartel members on these grows. It's about as dangerous of law enforcement mission as we probably could take on.
Sue, the raids where we were embedded with you guys, dozens and dozens and dozens of law enforcement people involved. they came on the heels of one raid where you captured some 38 suspects. In our cases, we actually saw the cartel operatives working in the field, armed, tending to the marijuana crops, yet you were not able to capture them. How big of a challenge is that? Because people think, look, you've got 100+ officers out there, agents, on horseback, helicopter, and yet these guys were able to get away.
Well, I can give you an example. When we were in Kane County, we had a phenomenal amount of land we had to traverse to essentially surround the grow. Now, it wasn't possible to surround the entire grow with law enforcement personnel because there were cliffs and land features that just made it impossible for us to traverse. Now, if you guys remember, one of the guys that worked for me was closing in on 2 of the suspects. They took one look at the agent that was approaching and they jumped off a cliff. They literally took the slide for life down this cliff that could have easily killed them. I certainly cannot ask any agent or police officer that's working out in the grow to take that same jump off the cliff. So unfortunately, while they got away, I would never ask a law enforcement officer to risk their life in that manner to capture somebody. So we'll get them another day.
You know, these operations are massive. Give me a sense for the planning, Frank, and how hard it is to keep this under wraps so word doesn't get out that you're going to do this the following morning.
Well, it's extremely difficult. We've had tremendous luck. We haven't been compromised, but when you look at these grows, we're using local SWAT teams, number of sheriff's deputies, large contingency from the state. And the one misconception is, look, that county sheriff who's elected by the people gets the final call whether we go or not. He's responsible for the law enforcement in that county. So there's a lot to it. We've been very, very fortunate, and we try and keep our operational security at the highest levels. But when you deal with this many different entities, that's always a concern. So far, we've had great luck. And so far, the sheriffs that we have such a great partnership with have made the right call on when to go and when not to go. And look, it's their county, and we're good with that. We look more at the international case and the evidence that we gather from getting in those grows.
Can you give us a sense where we are now? March is the beginning of grow season, is it not? So what's starting to happen right now in the mountains? How do these cartel members pick where they're going to start growing? Are they going to be in the same places, different places, and what's going to look like for you from now until the end of the summer?
Well, they're in about 3 weeks they'll start scouting. We had a lot of snow last night and the day before, so that may put them off. But in about 3 weeks they're going to start scouting for water sources. They'll start looking for good positions for concealment. And usually in about 5 or 6 weeks they'll start dragging in the supplies and getting their command and control and their resupply network geared up for an entire season.
These locations, Sue, are so remote, as we saw. How do you get onto them? How do you find out where they are in the first place?
It comes from a multitude of sources. First, recreators, hunters who are in the woods who either find an old grow or stumble into a new one will call and give us a tip. The sheriff's offices and my agents down in St. George are very in tune with the area, and they can kind of look at where there's water sources and where there are canyons and good soil to grow, so they kind of target these areas. The sheriff's deputies and the officers who work in those counties every day, they speak to the people who work in the hardware stores and at Walmart and Home Depot where they're potentially buying supplies for these grows. So there's a multitude of ways the information comes into us. Some obviously we have to protect. We can't give up all of our secrets, but the bulk of it comes from human intelligence, whether it be from civilians or law enforcement.
And when you talk about the state of Utah, how many grows do you suppose will be operating in this season?
Go ahead.
I have a question.
I suspect we're going to have fewer grows this year. The trend we've seen over the last 3 years is fewer grows with more arrests. And because of our dedicated effort and the efforts of the state and local law enforcement, I foresee us having maybe 1 to 7 grows this year, give or take. It just depends if the organization that we hit so hard this past summer decides to come back.
Frank, how do they get the marijuana out of there once it's harvested?
You know, they hand carry the marijuana out just like they hand carry the supplies in. So you'll have, the reason we had such success at what we call the general steam grow, where we had 38 individuals arrested, is because they'll mass to day labor that marijuana out. So they're hand carrying it out, putting it in trucks, and bringing it back to California. Very, very labor intense, sweat equity way of doing it, but it's the only means they have of getting the marijuana out.
Where does this investigation go from here? I mean, obviously you're not finished. There are things I'm sure that you cannot talk about in terms of this active investigation, but what can you tell us about where you go from here in these two departments?
You know, our partners with the state and local law enforcement and our federal partners will concentrate back on the grows this year, try and break this organization's back from not coming back to Utah. DEA's focus is on the international case. We're looking at the command and control in California, which actually answers to the command and control in Mexico. That's who we're looking to indict. That's who we're looking to bring to justice. And if I can, we have a phenomenal relationship with the U.S. Attorney, David Barlow, who is committed to bring these people to justice in the federal system. And within the federal system, there's no probation or parole, so when we arrest these individuals, they're going away for a very long time, which sends a very positive message back to the cartels that the people in Utah will bring them to justice and won't tolerate this kind of intrusion on our public lands.
Are you talking about the suspects from the grow that we witnessed?
Absolutely. Almost every individual that we arrest, we have commitment from the U.S. Attorney on these marijuana grows that they will be prosecuted federally. The overreaching case that we're looking at on the federal side, where we're targeting the command and control, that will definitely be brought to federal prosecution.
So we have a question from someone about when we filmed this episode and how long it took. The answer is we filmed it last August at the end of the grow season, and it took a few weeks to film, but you know, we were following the investigation as it unfolded, and it's still unfolding. So there is a high probability that we will continue to follow this, and might bring you an update, you know, later on in the summer.
Absolutely. I think what started, Dan, as a two-part Hansen investigation will probably turn into, you know, an hour-long, depending on how the investigation goes. Sue, which brings up an interesting question. You know, this is the first time, at least we've been able to embed at this level in such an operation, and what we were able to see was eye-opening by any standard. What's been the local reaction in Utah from people there?
The local reaction relative to grows on public lands, or it being in the media?
Well, both. Obviously, I'm sure people who live near these grows, you know, are not as surprised as the rest of the country to see this going on. But yeah, the reaction to the grows, number one, and to the fact that, you know, we were able to you know, broadcast this information.
Initially, the feedback I've been getting from people is just shock, surprised that this would ever happen on our public lands and that the government would let it occur. Obviously, the government isn't standing for it. We're going to fight it, and we're here to support the citizens, because the last thing we want is the public to be apprehensive to go out and recreate on their lands. And sadly, the local folks in southern Utah who are aware of these grows, they kind of have an idea of where they can and cannot go, and they're apprehensive about using their public lands, and that's something we're just never going to tolerate. The people of the state of Utah won't tolerate it. And I'm hoping that as a result of your broadcast, other states where this is an emerging trend that people aren't aware, that they stand up and they say, hey, we're not going to put up with this on our public lands either, and we'll push everybody right back to Mexico. Let them ruin their own lands.
And Frank, what states are you certain, off the top of your head, that you're certain that there is other activity from cartel members in public lands?
Dan, did you say the dates?
States.
Oh, states. Oh, this is predominant throughout the country. You know, we've had because of our strong enforcement in Utah, the grows in Nevada have tripled. California, Nevada, Utah, moving right up to the East Coast. And like I said, Wisconsin most recently had such trends that matched exactly what was happening in Utah 2 years ago. We sent agents up there who are there today teaching the tactics that we're utilizing, because in reality, the simple eradication of plants and hope these people doesn't come back, it doesn't work. You know, hope isn't a strategy. A strategy is to go arrest these people, bring them to justice, and let the American people know we're not going to tolerate it, and we're not going to allow thugs to take over our public lands. Just not going to happen.
Someone in Utah, in Montana specifically, is curious if there's activity that you know of in Montana at this time.
I don't have intelligence right in front of me. I can't honestly answer that question. If there's Sue may be able to address it better than me.
I can tell you that our investigation here in Utah is linked to cases in Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Illinois. I can also tell you that I've spoke with agents in Tennessee and Kentucky that are facing the same struggles we are. It is not even something that's limited to the West. It's predominant in the Midwest, in Missouri. But if it's in Idaho, if it's in Utah, if it's in Colorado, there's a chance it's in Montana, and we're going to work hard to identify it. And the citizens of Montana need to be aware when they go on their public lands, and they cannot be afraid to report it or report suspicious activity to law enforcement.
Sue, we have our last question that we're going to take today on our Google Hangout, and the question is, hypothetically, if someone finds a marijuana field in a forest, what should that person do?
If they have a GPS, they need to mark the grids. If they don't have a GPS where they can give us the grid coordinates, they need to equate it to whether it be a trail or any kind of significant land feature, so they can give us the best description as to where they found it. As soon as they stumble into a grow or what they think could be a component of a grow, which would be black irrigation piping, garbage, propane tanks, batteries, bags of fertilizer, or clippings of what would be trimmings of marijuana plants, they need to back out very quietly. Absolutely do not confront any marijuana growers. Back out the way they came in and immediately contact law enforcement.
Sue Thomas, Frank Smith of the DEA in Utah, thank you so much for joining us today and helping flesh out this story that we did last night. I also want to tell everybody that next Sunday we continue with some very interesting Hansen Files investigations, and I want to thank Dan Slepian, who's my good friend and producer, who did this story and one that's coming up next week that involves these companies selling a product that's purportedly health care insurance when it's not, and we've been working on this for a long time, Dan. And
Important story, important one.
thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
And we'll see you.
Hey, Christian, thank you for bringing this very, very serious public safety message to the people of America, and we appreciate everything you have done at Dateline.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Sue.
Great
See
day.
you.
See you guys.
Bye,
Have a
guys.
great day. Thank you.
Done?